This is the second lecture on Emil Durkheim. In this lecture, I hope to accomplish a number of tasks. One of them is to further solidify in your minds the meaning of the term functionalism. There's a reason for this because Emil Durkheim is essentially identified with this term. Then we are going to turn to the two important works you are introduced to by Durkheim in your text. We've already talked about the rules of the sociological method. We've talked about the division of labor in society. And next we're going to take up suicide and then the elementary forms of the religious life. I will conclude by bringing to your attention one of the major disputes that was occurring in France at the end of the 19th century, into which Durkheim was drawn. He wasn't heavily political, but in this particular instance, he became highly political. Now, what is functionalism? This is a way of understanding social life by making an analogy. It is as if you took society as an organism or a machine. Once you make this analogy, there are all kinds of aspects, dimensions that start to appear, naturally from the logic of a machine or an organism. An organism is made up of parts. The parts are all interrelated and work together. There must be some mechanism of all the parts to assist any of the parts should they have a difficulty and need assistance. There are threats coming from the outside of the organism which need to be repelled. You can see that a global perspective is forced upon you once you take on this analogy as being an accurate depiction of society. Marx, of course, would have had a problem with this approach because what it does is it takes society itself as a thing, as Durkheim takes social facts as things, and reifies them. Reification is actually taking something which is an abstraction and then making it into a thing that has power over us. We talked about Marx's attitude toward religion as exactly this kind of thing. So what Durkheim is doing is something very similar. He's taking society as a thing, and its parts, the social facts that make it up, are actual things. They leave the realm of simple ideas and take on this feature of being able to force themselves upon individuals who are operating in society. This is a position that has not been without criticism, and we're going to be talking about that criticism shortly. But before we get to that, there's another interesting aspect to this idea of functionalism, which was not unpopular in the 19th century and has its roots all the way back to Comte and to Spencer in England as well. Herbert Spencer was a great proponent of this way of approaching the understanding of social life. What did they do in the late 18th and early 19th century to understand human society, which seemed a bit of a miracle, and in fact, in a way it is. Just to digress for a moment, we talked about social solidarity in the last lecture, that this is something that permeates throughout a society and allows people to feel connected and attached to each other, and therefore one might even say perform the society together. The way I put this to students so that your imaginations can share the wonder in this phenomenon is, think about it this way. Every day, 350 million people wake up and do the United States. Now, what do I mean when I say this? Each individual engages in a myriad number of individual acts. these acts are not taken with the idea they need to coordinate with all the 350 million other people performing acts, but yet somehow they do. They all fit together, and in total add up to this thing we call American society. I just use the United States as an example in this particular instance, but you can pick anything. 60 million Frenchmen get up, and French women get up every morning, and they do France. You know, they reproduce their language by speaking it. They reproduce their cuisine by cooking it. They reproduce all the attitudes that French people have by acting as French people do. Now, you might say this is silly because they really have no choice. But is that true? If a society was willing to make a transition on such a gigantic level, there's nothing that would stop it. But it seems that the obstacles in the path of doing something like that would be rather extreme. In fact, you might even say it's something like trying to make a revolution. And this is where I'm leading you. There are societies that take on pieces of other societies. In South America, I believe Ecuador uses the dollar for its medium of exchange. They simply took the American dollar. This seems like some sort of technical detail, but peoples do make such choices. Now, there was an analogy that was also made at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, which was, for some people, very disagreeable. If you think about the animal world, some animals are social animals. Not all. Some animals are less social than others. They live solitary individual lives and are only social to the extent that they need to procreate. And there are even mammals who live in this way. Bears, for instance, are fairly solitary, except, of course, for the mother and children. The cubs and the female bear have a bond and keep together for a long period of time. But eventually that comes to an end and they separate. But male bears, pretty much when they become adults, maraud and do not act in a very social fashion, even with other bears. Although I just read an article by coincidence that seemed to dispute this, that said that bears, in fact, were more gregarious than we gave them credit for. But if you look at other social animals, there's quite a contrast. And probably the one that's used most to make this kind of comparison with humans are bees, social insects. They're not mammals. There are a few mammals that are organized anywhere near human beings in terms of complexity. Even if you go down further on the evolutionary scale to anthropoids, you will find some similarities with the human family, but not with the more complex, greater societies that humans have created. This is not entirely the case when you look at something like bees. Bees have a society composed of thousands of members. There's specialization where some of them gather, some of them fight. There is a queen. And this idea of a queen was very attractive at the beginning of the 19th century, especially for the English, because they had a queen. Here was an island which was a hive of activity, people busy doing all the business of nascent capitalism, the Industrial Revolution whirring along, and bees seemed to provide the perfect example. Bees seemed to provide the perfect parallel. They were little machines themselves. They never varied in their behavior. They were totally loyal. The solidarity among bees gets close to 100%. There's no disagreement or complaint. None of them are plotting a revolution. They're all going along with the program. Of course, in the case of bees, it's a genetic program, but it still provided a way of looking at the human social order. One might even say that in this analogy, one finds the spirit of functionalism. Society has parts, there is a necessary order, some are in control, some follow, others defend, some are responsible for the function of feeding the community, and so on. Functionalism, though, does not seem to take into account the problems that arise in society, the inequalities and injustices that exist within society render it illegitimate from the start, so that you can't take the perspective that order in a situation where order really permits very negative things to happen to vast portions of populations is something that by definition should be given a pass. This is the tension between conflict theorists and functionalists. And if you can understand that, you understand the difference, for one thing, between Marx and Durkheim, and also between conflict theory and functionalism. We are going to study some theorists who fall within the conflict camp, and some seem to have a leg in a number of camps. You might call them an eclectic. An eclectic is somebody who takes something from a whole host of different sets of ideas. Everybody hates an eclectic because they don't turn out to agree with anybody. But some of our thinkers are like that. They can't really be easily categorized as a conflict theorist or a functionalist. In the United States, functionalism became very popular in the 1960s. There is an entire chapter in our text devoted to it, and we will take that up in not too long. So, getting back to Durkheim, he is considered the father of functionalism, both for anthropology and for sociology. Anthropology texts will introduce Durkheim in much the same way that sociology texts do. We share him as a kind of grandfather, but only in terms of his functionalist perspective. In order that you can more easily understand functionalism, let us turn to Durkheim's work, Suicide. Now, if you consider the phenomenon that suicide represents, if there is any act that seems to be individual, that seems to be something people do alone and for very singular reasons, it would seem that that act would be suicide. But Durkheim does not take this point of view. He does something fairly startling for the thinkers of his day and rejects psychological explanations of suicide alone. He admits that in individual cases, obviously, people will be drawn to that awful deed for reasons that apply simply to them by virtue of their own psychology. But something else happens when you widen your investigation, which is what he did. By the end of the 19th century, governments throughout Europe and throughout the world had become fairly adept at gathering statistics. So he was able to rely on a great deal of statistics that he could then compare and contrast. And what he found was really interesting. It seemed to take the phenomenon of suicide from consideration as an individual act and raise it to a social phenomenon that did not necessarily have social causes, although it might, but certainly had effects that were social. And we will see this as we go through the discussion. Now, what did he do? First of all, he had to contend with another theorist at the time named Gabriel Tarde, T-A-R-D-E. I've mentioned this to you once before. Tarde was one of his contemporary competitors on the social scientific scene. Tard was pushing the idea that society could be explained by imitation. The idea of imitation is not necessarily a bad one, because people do what they see others do. So imitation is not to be immediately discounted as an explanation for social behavior. In fact, it seems to make a great deal of sense. So Durkheim took this on to begin with and asked, do people commit suicide as a result of imitation? Because they see, maybe by reading it in the newspaper or whatever, that other people have committed suicide. So they would tend to sort of bunch up in time. One suicide, which is highly publicized, would tend to lead to others. So he went through newspapers over periods of years, looking for any kind of evidence that this might have happened. And the statistics did not bear it out. There did not seem to be any particular increase in the number of suicides by virtue of those happening or reported in the newspaper. He then did things like look at the phases of the moon, that maybe the weather or the moon or some other environmental effect might have had a cause on the statistics, the suicide statistics, the rate of suicide, that countries that were colder or hotter had more or less suicides. But he found what we would call today some very interesting correlations. I need to stop and define for you what a correlation is. This is a mathematical relationship. You measure two variables, and you find that one variable, and I'll be fairly silly about it. Suppose you go into a county and you measure, or you go into many counties, and in each county you measure the number of ice cream stores and the number of people with red hair. And then you compute the correlation. You feed the data into the formula that produces a correlation. Now, if there is a perfect correlation, the result will be what we call a Pearson's R of either +1 or -1. So let's just say that in counties where people had no red hair, there were no ice cream stores. 0. And where people had red hair, they all had the highest number of ice cream stores. Well, that would seem to suggest a correlation, a positive correlation between red hair and ice cream stores. As the presence of red hair increases, the number of ice cream stores increase. So this is a correlation of +1, if it's perfect. If it's only imperfect, suppose you only find that there are maybe a greater number, but not a perfect correlation where there's 0 and many, but you find a scattering of ice cream stores in counties where people have no red hair, and a higher smattering in where people have, they do have red hair. Well, that might be a correlation. Instead of a +1.00, it might be a correlation of +0.65. There are two things to note from this example. The first is that the relationship between ice cream stores and red hair is spurious. Spurious means that it is a kind of statistical blip. It may exist, but it doesn't mean anything. You can correlate any two variables that you choose, but it does underline that correlation does not mean causation. Just because two variables are related to each other doesn't mean that one causes the other. For instance, you might find a correlation between lung cancer and cigarette smoking. It turns out that there is a relationship between smoking cigarettes and getting lung cancer. The more cigarette smoking in a population, the higher the lung cancer rates. This will be a very powerful correlation. Does that mean that smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer? it doesn't necessarily mean that in every case that people who smoke cigarettes will get lung cancer. There is a relationship between the two. You can't go the other way either. You couldn't say that lung cancer causes cigarette smoking. I mean, that would be ridiculous. So you have to approach the idea of correlation with some caution, because these things can easily be misinterpreted. But what Durkheim did find are still very persuasive kinds of relationships between the data that he studied. This is what Durkheim was computing in a way, but he couldn't compute correlation because Pearson's R had not yet been invented. So he could not look at the statistics in quite the same scientific way that we are capable of doing now. Nonetheless, given the obstacles that he had to overcome, he did some remarkable analysis and found things like this: that people who were married committed suicide at a rate less than people who were single. He also found that people who were married and had children committed suicide at rates less than people who were married and didn't have children. He found that women committed suicide at levels quite a bit less than men. Then there was this difference between men and women who were married and who became widowed. This he found quite significant, because single men have much higher suicide rates than single women. When men marry, the suicide rates of married men is much lower than the suicide rates of single men. So marriage gives them a kind of protection. He even computed what that was. He called it the coefficient of protection. What he meant by that was that when men marry, their suicide rates fall quite a bit. When women marry, the coefficient of protection for women also exists, but women don't gain as much as men because their suicide rate was low to begin with, even though it does go lower when they marry. When the reverse happens, when men become widowers, they commit suicide more often than women who become widows. Widows have a higher coefficient of protection. Now, there were ways of explaining this. He tried to explain it in social ways. He said that what men were getting from marriage was a kind of release from a great deal of work and chore that they would have had to do if they remained single. They no longer need to do their laundry. They don't have to worry about their social engagements. A whole social world exists that the wife sort of keeps up for them. Life becomes, at least in the 19th century this was true, not quite a vacation for men, but they were relieved of a great deal of responsibility that they had to take on when they were single. And of course, when men become widowers, the reverse happens to them. All the things that their wives were doing for them, they're not doing for them anymore, and the men have to revert to that life they had as a bachelor, which Durkheim says puts them at risk for suicide. Women tend to be more social, more gregarious. When they become widows, they don't sit still. They keep busy. They engage with the community, with other women. Men tend to die younger than women do. Women have to look forward to a certain number of years of widowhood. So this is what he called the coefficient of protection. There was another element in his discussion between countries that were Protestant and Catholic. He looked at populations within Europe that were Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. And he noticed that in Catholic countries, the suicide rate was lower than in Protestant countries. And there were all kinds of possibilities to explain this that had to be controlled for. Protestant countries tended to be more far advanced on the Industrial Revolution. Life in these countries was more difficult in terms of stress, and Catholic countries might have remained more rural and more traditional. So these might have also been factors. But the greatest factor was religion itself, because the Catholic Church preaches that when you commit suicide, you're committing a mortal sin and won't be able to get into heaven. You can't be buried in consecrated ground. So Durkheim felt that this explained why suicides were more likely in Protestant than in Catholic countries. Now, if we look at an individual suicide, they're not necessarily calculating on this basis. They don't say to themselves, well, listen, I'm a Catholic male who's been married many years. I'm now a widower. So what are the odds that I'm going to commit suicide? I have these pressures. Should I succumb to them? This is not what an individual asks themselves. They are operating on an entirely different level. But what Durkheim is attempting to achieve in his book Suicide is show us that social phenomena are real. That when you look at the statistics from the sociological perspective, you gain information you can gain in no other way. Because these are not psychological explanations. These are sociological explanations. But we should emphasize that you're talking about rates. We're not talking about individuals. Psychology tries to explain the behavior of individuals. Sociology does not. He was gathering the rates of entire societies, the rates of suicide. So you had hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals composing those rates. And each one of them had their own story to tell. But above and beyond their own story, when you mix them all together, it produces yet another level of analysis. And that's the sociological level. And this is the great achievement that can be found, one of the great achievements that can be found in Durkheim's work, Suicide. Now, there was another contribution he made in this book where he divided up the types of suicide. So let's talk about them. There were 4 types of suicide. There was altruistic suicide, egoistic suicide, fatalistic suicide, and anomic suicide. So let's talk about these in order. But before we can talk about the individual types, we have to understand how he approached the analysis of them. Durkheim made the observation that within society, 2 opposing forces seem to exist. The forces of social integration, where people are brought within the society and made a part of it, and social regulation, where society regulates how people live out their lives. These 2 aspects of social life can vary so that you can have either too much social integration or too little social integration. You can have too much social regulation or too little social regulation. Too much social integration, he then described when it led to suicide as altruistic suicide. Altruism, if you know what this word means, is doing for others. And altruistic suicide is when you give your life up for the greater good, for the society, for the commonality. The example of this might be a kamikaze pilot in the Japanese Air Force during World War II who flew their planes purposely into American Navy ships so that the planes would explode and cause as much damage as possible. Of course, killing the pilot. He was committing suicide. Durkheim called that altruistic suicide. I once remember reading a horrible story in the newspaper in San Francisco about a mother who was driving, I think it was in Richmond, California, and her car stalled on train tracks. And before she was able to assessed the situation properly, a train was bearing down on her very fast, and she had 2 children in the car. All she could do was either throw the children out of the car or get out herself, and she chose to throw her children out. That is an example of altruistic suicide. This is social integration, and there's too much of it. Now, on the other side, you can have social integration and too little of it. He called this, when it resulted in suicide, egoistic suicide. Individuals who have no connection with a greater community, who are loners, who live by themselves, who shun others and others shun them, who can't seem to feel at home. These are the people who are led to commit egoistic suicide. You might also find people in this category who feel that they're better than everybody else. People who don't feel that they can become a part of a larger scene because they are above everyone who they happen to meet. So people who are narcissists might commit egoistic suicide. So you've got altruistic on the one hand, egoistic on the other. Too much social integration, too little social integration. Now, on the level of social regulation, you can have too much, and this Durkheim, only in a footnote. It's very interesting. He didn't give this term a great deal of attention, but he called it fatalistic suicide. It's the one he gave the smallest amount of attention in his book, Suicide. What is fatalistic suicide? The great example I think you can use to understand it is Romeo and Juliet, or any couple that is in love who are forbidden to continue their love because maybe the families are incompatible or for some other reason their love is doomed. And they choose suicide as a route to solve and end their agony. So this is too much social regulation. People are boxed in a corner. And it might not just be a matter of love. It might be a matter of somebody who aspires to a place in an Ivy League university and has failed in an exam and can never get in, would never be able to get in or couldn't afford it because maybe their parents have lost all their money and are bankrupt. This could cause fatalistic suicide. Now, on the other hand, too little social regulation, he called anomic suicide. And this word anomie was an important word for Durkheim, one of the words that he is identified with. Marx had the word alienation. Durkheim had the word anomie. They're kind of related, but Durkheim's word applies to a particular sociological scene. When society fails to impose enough regulation on people, the order that exists within society collapses. This is a situation of anomie. And a good example of this would be during a financial collapse. 1929, the stock market collapses. People who were wealthy in 10 minutes find that they have nothing. This is something that they cannot abide. It is not just a matter of disappointment. It's a matter of a whole inner psychological economy collapses along with it. The place the individual had in society, their friends, the places they would go, the people they would see, all of this now is no longer possible. And because of that, they commit anomic suicide, because society no longer regulates, or they feel no longer a part and have no place in the greater society. A situation of anomie can exist very easily within a social order. It happens to a degree when any cataclysm occurs in a society. I think you might say that after 9/11 in the United States, we all experienced a degree of Durkheimian anomie. There was the sense that no one was in control. This was something that was dispelled as quickly as possible, but nonetheless, it was out there. It was palpable. You could feel it. So this idea of anomie is a concept that you should understand and, of course, identify with Durkheim. So I think you've got a good introduction to his work Suicide. Let us turn to the elementary forms of the religious life. The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life is Durkheim's last work. He takes on the institution of religion and attempts to find the function, the basis for religion itself in the social world. He does so through an analysis of a great deal of anthropological material. One of the concepts that captured the imagination not only of sociologists and anthropologists and psychoanalysts was this concept of totem. What is a totem? This is a symbol used to represent the tribe. There's a great discussion as to what it in fact does represent, how it functions within the clan and within the tribe. Why does a tribe choose, say, the bear for its totem? Many of you are familiar with the totem poles that the Northwest indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada build. These totem poles have various animals depicted on them. Now why? What purpose did these animals have on a symbolic production? Were these animals chosen for their characteristics? Bears being ferocious and so on? It seems unlikely. But nonetheless, they were very important to the tribe and operated as part of their religious identification and their tribal identification. The two seem to be wedded. And Durkheim, in his Elementary Forms, is trying to tackle this concept of totem and analyze what function it had and what role that it played. In doing this, he took pains to define the basis of religion, what it consisted of. And your text gives you readings that bring this out for you very well. He saw religion as divided into two basic forms. There were rites, R-I-T-E-S, and beliefs. Rites are actions that people must perform in relation to sacred objects. Beliefs are the things that tell you what those sacred objects are and what rites need to be performed. Religion is divided between action and thought. Rites are the actions and beliefs are the thought. Along with this, we need to understand the distinction between the sacred and the profane. The sacred, and this is, I think, common sense, are those things that are special, set apart, magnificent, unusual, and the profane are lower things. They're everyday things. They're common. They're not special. And this distinction between the sacred and the profane is at the heart of religion because religion makes this distinction. He says that you can't define religion on the basis of gods or other beings that it worships. This is not the characteristic that truly defines it, at least not in a sociological sense. Of course, many people believe in a whole host of religions that involve personalities of one kind or another, gods of one kind or another. But Durkheim says that for the purpose of analysis, this is not sufficient. There are religions that don't put a tremendous emphasis on individuals. Asian religions, for instance, like Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, even though there are masters who brought the wisdom to the world, these individuals are respected rather than worshipped. There may be forms of worship that exist, but they aren't the center of what these particular sets of beliefs involve. These are maxims. These are ways of approaching human reality and living a life. They give you advice, but they don't tell you what you must do. They're not commandments. So, in order to include as many phenomena as possible under the general heading of religion, we can't insist that our particular view of religion, because it's the one that we happen to believe, is characteristic of all religions. This is a problem of language. What are you going to do when you use a word? How are you going to create the category that that word is supposed to cover? What goes in and what doesn't? So Durkheim made these distinctions between rites and beliefs, the sacred and the profane. He made another observation in the elementary forms, which is very controversial. It's highly interesting, I think, as well, that when we worship in a religion, whether it's a god or whatever it is, we are not truly worshiping this entity. What we're worshiping is society itself. Because he asks, what is it that is outside of individuals that has power over them, that is being made plain in worship when people gather together and perform common rites? People are really recognizing the power of the social. They're not saying that to themselves. They're not reciting lines that say this. But Durkheim says this is in fact what they are doing, whether they know they're doing it or not. They are worshiping society. They are recognizing the greater power that society exercises over them. This, he says, is what religion is all about. Now, many students in the past, when I have made this comment, immediately rush in to argue with Durkheim and try to find reason to reject it. And I can understand that you might feel the same way. But whether we agree with Durkheim or not, that's not the point. This is what he said. And we are studying Durkheim and his system of functional sociology. So that's all that you need to know. You don't need to accept Durkheim's idea as correct. You just need to understand that this is what he said. He also made statements. I mentioned earlier that he tended even to a symbolic interactionist perspective. In the elementary forms, I don't think that this is one of the parts of the book given in your readings, but I'll quote him, quote, "Thus, social life in all its aspects and in every period of its history is made possible only by a vast symbolism. The material emblems and figurative representations with which we are more especially concerned in our present study are one form of this, but there are many others." That, I think, is characteristic of what a symbolic interactionist might say. But he goes on to say something that is very revealing, very interesting. Let me read this to you. "Collective sentiments can just as well become incarnate in persons or formulae. Some formulae are flags, while there are persons, either real or mythical, who are symbols. But there is one sort of emblem which should make an early appearance without reflection or calculation. That is tattooing. Indeed, well-known facts demonstrate that it is produced almost automatically in certain conditions. When men of an inferior culture are associated in a common life, they are frequently led by an instinctive tendency, as it were, to paint or cut upon the body images that bear witness to their common existence. According to a text of Procopius, the early Christians printed on their skin the name of Christ or the sign of the cross. For a long time, the groups of pilgrims going to Palestine were also tattooed on the arm or wrist with designs representing the cross or the monogram of Christ. Now, I find it interesting that Durkheim makes a kind of editorial comment about the culture of tattooing. He says, when men of an inferior culture. He doesn't explain exactly what he means by this, but such a sentence, again from Durkheim, if you remember in our last lecture I called your attention to a sentence where he talked about just punishment of heretics, and now he's making a comment about the inferior culture of people who engage in tattooing. This should not be allowed to pass unremarked. It is obvious, and I'm going to make this point again when we begin our discussion of Weber, that everybody starts from somewhere. Durkheim is embedded in his time and place. He is very bourgeois. He has his likes and dislikes and prejudices. And lo and behold, I think they seem to come in to his writing. We need to be attentive to this. No one escapes. Everybody analyzes from a point of view and with a purpose. If you're a Marxist, you criticize because you are thinking in Marxist terms. If you're a functionalist, you are analyzing and criticizing because you're thinking in functionalist terms. That doesn't mean that you can't think in other terms, but very often either people cynically want to impose a point of view or unconsciously impose a point of view. This is something I would very much like to hear discussed among students. How do we react to this kind? Let me read you a longer reading, a paragraph, which also I think will get you thinking about Durkheim and about social theorists in general and how you need to approach them. Durkheim says, again from the Elementary Forms, but in the first place, things are arbitrarily simplified when religion is seen only on its idealistic side. In its way, it is realistic. There is no physical or moral ugliness. There are no vices or evils which do not have a special divinity. There are gods of theft and trickery, of lust and war, of sickness and of death. Christianity itself, however so high the idea which it has made of the divinity may be, has been obliged to give the spirit of evil a place in its mythology. Satan is an essential piece of the Christian system. Even if he is an impure being, he is not a profane one. The anti-God is a god, inferior and subordinated, it is true, but nevertheless endowed with extended powers. He is even the object of rights, at least of negative ones. Thus religion, far from ignoring the real society and making abstraction of it, is in its image. It reflects all its aspects, even the most vulgar and the most repulsive. All is to be found there, and if in the majority of cases we see the good victorious over evil, life over death, the powers of light over the powers of darkness, it is because reality is not otherwise. if the relation between these two contrary forces were reversed, life would be impossible. But as a matter of fact, it maintains itself and even tends to develop. I find this paragraph fairly strange because it does not seem to jibe with what I understand reality to be. Yes, I think we can admit that religion, and he uses Christianity in this case, does reflect reality in a way, but he seems to end the paragraph by suggesting that there is victory over evil, life over death. Well, one would hope that that's the case, but we see enough examples in social reality to provide us with a great deal of pessimism. So, if religion is being overly optimistic in the way that it sees reality, how is it reflecting reality? I don't see this myself. Again, I would be curious to hear any reactions from students. The last part of this lecture is a discussion of the role that Durkheim played in the great controversy that enveloped France at the end of the 19th century over the fate of Captain Alfred Dreyfus. You see his picture here. Dreyfus was born in Alsace, very similar to Durkheim, and they both came from Jewish families. Dreyfus made his career in the army and eventually found himself at the highest echelons of that army. At the end of the 1890s, evidence was discovered that someone had been spying for the Germans. The Germans, of course, were the arch enemy of the French, and the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War still needed to be explained. It seemed, of course, that maybe treason was involved. This was not something that Dreyfus was accused of, but he was accused of passing information to the Germans about French armaments. There was a thing called the bordereau, which had something resembling his handwriting on it that implicated him. Turns out that the evidence used against Dreyfus was a frame-up. It was false. The true villain in the piece was a fellow named Esterhazy, who was of Hungarian extraction, who had actually sold the information to the Germans and then turned around and had it fixed so Dreyfus would be blamed. The whole thing was very difficult to tease out, and at his trial, he was condemned. This was in 1895. He was sent to Devil's Island, which is in the South. It's not in the South Atlantic. It's off the coast of French Guiana, and had a reputation for being a place of torment and misery. In any case, forces within France were not satisfied with the injustice that had been done. It was always suspected that Dreyfus was innocent. Social forces coalesced, especially the conservative forces of the army, the church, and certain reactionary intellectuals who believed that if Dreyfus was innocent, that even in that case, since he was a member of the army, he needed to accept his fate and go off without calling the reputation and the honor of the army of the French into question. Basically, he should fall on his sword just to hide the iniquity and the falsehood of others. It was quite a thing to ask him to do. The controversy shaped up as the forces within the Third Republic of secularity, those people who wanted a secular society, those people who were intellectuals and what we would call liberals today, and basically progressives. They believe that no society should send an innocent man to prison for something that the individual didn't do and then ask them to cooperate in the injustice in order to keep society's reputation intact. There was agitation for quite a number of years to have a retrial. Dramatic events occurred where various individuals committed suicide or attempted to in the army, and it was eventually proven that he was in fact innocent. But it tore French society apart. Either you were a Dreyfusard or an anti-Dreyfusard. If you were a Dreyfusard, you supported Dreyfus and those forces within the Third Republic that represented progress. If you were an anti-Dreyfusard, you were opposed to such secularity and progressive forces. The first time the word intellectual was used, it apparently was coined by a fellow named Ferdinand Brunetière, who was an anti-Dreyfusard, and the word intellectual was used as an epithet. In the 1950s, it was very similar because the word egghead was used in the same way. If you were called an egghead, you were a square, you were a long hair, you listened to classical music, you read books, and you had ideas. Well, it was the same thing at the end of the 19th century for certain folks, and that is how the word intellectual got off the ground, as a kind of insult to people who supported Alfred Dreyfus. Durkheim joined a campaign in his support. He thought that this was a great injustice and brought all his talents to bear within the committee that he had formed to seek justice in Dreyfus's case. His activity did not make all the difference. It added to the weight that was put on those forces who were attempting to see Dreyfus rot on Devil's Island forever. In a way, Durkheim violates some of his notions of social solidarity and collective conscience, because the French collective conscience was not uniform. In fact, it was quite splintered. There were people opposed and people in support of Dreyfus. So the role that he played in the Dreyfus case is an interesting one and can be seen as contradictory in some respects. If you want to get a really good idea of Durkheim's role in the Dreyfus case, and beyond that, if you want to get a good idea of Durkheim himself and his place in sociology, the biography to read is the one by Stephen Lukes. The Lukes biography is it's almost 700 pages, and gives you a really thorough grounding in Durkheim and his thought. In the chapter that Lukes discusses Dreyfus, he says this about Durkheim. He says, Durkheim's was the authentic attitude of the Dreyfusard intellectual. It was precisely this high-minded attitude on the part of many of the academic supporters of Dreyfus that so incensed the anti-Dreyfusards, from the hooligans who broke up their lectures to sophisticated men of letters who scorned them in print. Catholic polemicists pilloried the ignoble race of these academics who spend their lives teaching error and in corrupting souls, and in due course society as a whole. They were the atheistic educators of the young, agents of social harm, the main source of evil, the true enemies of social order. So spoke the anti-Dreyfusard intellectuals and what they accused Durkheim and his compatriots of. Although I have many difficulties with Durkheim on a whole host of scores, nonetheless, he ratified and insisted on the importance of the social. The individual cannot be seen from the point of view as an individual alone, because such a thing for Durkheim would not exist. It's something that I'm always laughing at when I hear somebody say that they're a self-made man. They usually say self-made man. You never hear self-made woman, because women know better. The idea of a self-made man would not be consistent with Durkheimian thought. Individuals, of course, exist, but in the substance of them, they are thoroughly social. The very ideas they have of themselves, they have gotten by virtue of living within society. The language they use to form their ideas is not a language they invented. It's a language that they use along with millions of others. They participate in a social activity. There is no such thing as a self-made man. We are all, each of us, part of a greater whole. We fit into the social order. We support it, and it supports us. This is one of the basic themes that one takes out of Durkheim, how the social is something real and how we need to recognize that. Now, once recognizing that it is real, that can be taken too far. It can be taken in directions with which we don't necessarily have to follow. The reality of society by itself doesn't mean we can say which kind of society, how does it work, what is its contents, and so on. Durkheim had no trouble editorializing about it. He wasn't simply drawing a kind of outline, and in that outline just about anything could fit. He fleshed in that outline. He was willing to call societies primitive. He was willing to say that people who tattooed themselves came from inferior societies. This is something that I think we need to watch. Well, I hope that gives you a good idea of what Durkheim was about, where he was coming from. His life ended in 1917 during the First World War, and it's mostly attributed to the fact that his son, Andrei, was killed in the war, and he died of a broken heart. He died of complications of ailments that were exacerbated by the terrible news that he could not accept. If you have any questions about Durkheim or any of the theorists we discuss, please make sure you ask them in the course discussion boards. Each chapter has its own discussion board, and of course you get credit for doing so. This is the end of part 2 of Emil Durkheim.